So basically what we've done is we've surveyed our audience to see how they feel about politics, and it's pretty grim. So 89% said they don't feel inspired and 93% said they don't feel represented. Why do you think that is?
Well, it could be the content that this place produces for the country. Like, we're in a, a national housing crisis, and instead of producing the hundreds of thousands of millions of public homes, we've had, 2.5 years of denial from the government. We've got a genocide happening. And instead of even labelling it as that and speaking about that, we have a government that seems to soft pedal on it. Young people are looking to politics for solutions and honesty, and they're getting neither of them at the moment. I think it's little wonder that people are disengaging.
We've spoken before about the Australian government's complicity in potential war crimes by Israel in Gaza. The US recently made it clear that they would pull funding if Israel went into Rafah, but it looks like they're doing that anyways. What do you think that changes about how Australia should once again approach ties or lack of ties with Israel?
Well, Israel doesn't seem to feel it's constrained by either the opinions of their friends and neighbours, let alone international law. And the most recent, or the ongoing attack on Rafah is part of what has been now months and months of a genocidal campaign against Palestine and the Palestinians. The question I think many people are asking of our government is, well, how many Palestinian lives need to be lost before the government is going to take a clear and unequivocal stance against this attack on Palestine? And we don't know the answer yet. We know it's not 30,000. We know it's not 35,000. What is the number for the Albanese government? There is only one response you can do when you see a genocide taking place, and that is everything in your power to end it. That's what international law says. That's what a basic sense of morality says, and that's what we should be doing. So what should we be doing? We should be immediately ending the two-way arms trade with Israel. It's appalling that we are supplying weapons and weapons parts into that genocide. We should absolutely cancel all contracts with Israeli arms manufacturers, because one of the reasons we buy their weapons is they tell us that they've been tested and are effective, and they've been tested on Palestinians. We should have no part in that, but instead the Albanese government has signed over $1 billion of fresh contracts with Israeli arms manufacturers. We should be putting targeted sanctions against the extreme elements of the Netanyahu government. And we should absolutely consider taking further diplomatic steps, such as expelling the Israeli ambassador, given how that government does not feel bound by international norms. And we should do all of that because that's within our power to do what we can to prevent a genocide from happening.
And what do you make of the Labor government supporting the UN motion to look at Palestinian state membership?
That's the kind of hollow statement with no substance behind it that makes people so sick of politics. And in fact, what I found even more frustrating about that was within hours of Australian supporting that motion, which was spoken by some as being recognition of Palestinian statehood, that we had the Foreign Minister Penny Wong come out and say unambiguously, this is not a vote in support of Palestinian statehood. Do not mistake it as that. It's a very marginal procedural vote that they're doing. And it's that kind of narrow casting that I think sickens people about politics. Messages that are being crafted, often quite contradictory, to try and entice different parts of the electorate and persuade them that the Labor government or the coalition opposition is on their side. I think people are smarter than that. I think they're putting those statements together and saying, actually, you stand for nothing. And I think that's what that showed.
And a lot of people around Australia, and our audience especially, are growing increasingly more angry with the lack of, I suppose, support for Palestinians and calling out what a lot of people see as humanitarian crisis caused by Israel. Obviously, a lot of the students have taken protest and taken a side and set up encampments in the similar style to the US. There seems to be, in certain parts of the country, confusion about how to think of the student protests. Why do you think there's a lot of fears that they're anti-Semitic?
Can I say, first of all, I've been to the encampment down at University of Tasmania. I've been to the encampment at ANU. I've been to the encampment in my home city of Sydney at Sydney University. And I have seen students from all walks of life, many of them Jewish students, who have made an absolute commitment to end a genocide, to speak out against the genocide, and do it informed and underpinned by concepts of peace and non-violence. These are non-violent protests. And there's something very cooked in our politics when our political leaders, our Prime Minister, our opposition leader, premiers around the country, are focusing their anger and calling out students who are peacefully protesting against a genocide and trying to stop a genocide. And that's where their anger and their political action is addressed, rather than the genocide itself. It's a pretty appalling political tactic. And I have, on each of those camps that I've attended, those university encampments that I've attended, I have heard the leadership, and not just in the full glaze of publicity, but in their organising meetings outside of public scrutiny, make a rock-solid commitment to stand in solidarity with Jewish students, to oppose anti-Semitism, but to not conflate anti-Semitism with opposition to the genocidal policies of the Israeli government. And I think there's something so broken in our politics when it's somehow a violent crime to peacefully protest against genocide, and that's the political issue rather than the genocide itself. It's pretty hard to explain how it's got such a stranglehold on politics. But, you look through history, the students who protested against the Vietnam War were called divisive and disloyal and were attacked by most political leaders. The students who spoke out against the apartheid movement, the same thing. It was said to be deeply un-Australian to put a sporting boycott on South African sporting teams. Well, I think it's deeply, deeply Australian. It reflects our values to call out apartheid, to call out a genocide, and I commend the students for what they did.
There were reportedly attacks on the encampments in the University of Melbourne with glass bottles, bats and fire extinguishers from those trying to break into the encampment. It seems there's a lot of concern for the violence, as you were saying, that the encampments may produce, but why is there a lot of silence on what the violence those actual students face?
It's not even silence when there's violence directed against the peaceful encampments. It's sometimes weaponised against the encampments to say that they're inciting violence. The fact of their peaceful but visible protest against a genocide, if that attracts violence, that's also weaponised against the student protesters. And again, it shows just how unprincipled that part of politics is in this country. We've seen in the United States how violent attacks against the student encampments were allowed to happen for a significant period of time before police intervened. Yet the very slightest infringement by the pro-Palestinian supporters sees brutal police repression, and often it doesn't even require an infringement, just their mere existence. People are seeing this asymmetry in the political response. They're seeing this asymmetry in the policing response, and they're right to call it out.
What do you make of the footage that has been circulating of Israeli protesters destroying aid packages that are bound for Gaza?
We've seen some of the most extreme anti-humanitarian, violent protests occurring against the offices of UNRWA. We saw efforts to burn the offices of UNRWA down in Jerusalem, and fires were lit. The fire spread. We've seen repeated efforts to block aid convoys going into Palestine to prevent a catastrophic famine, and we've seen it escalate up to instances of violence. I haven't heard a single politician from the Labor government or from the coalition call that out. I can't understand how that they don't recognise that a violent efforts to prevent aid getting into Gaza to prevent a famine is deeply offensive, and yet they seem to have a filter on that the most egregious, violent action undertaken by somebody who supports the state of Israel can be ignored, but the slightest infringement or some sort of policing of words will bring down a ton of bricks if you support the people of Palestine. And again, I say, young people see this and they say, what is so wrong with politics? And you ask why they were disengaging from politics, because politics does shit like that. That's why people engage from politics.
Yeah, I can definitely vouch that we see that, and it does kind of add to a sense of hopelessness that a lot of us feel, especially when we see people like Prime Minister Albanese say that the students at the encampments chanting from the river to the sea couldn't point out Jordan on the map. And it kind of feels belittling. But what do you make of, I guess, him saying that, but also from someone who, before he became Prime Minister, was very pro-Palestinian, was involved in different marches and things like that?
I think seeing somebody with the power and authority of the Prime Minister mocking good people, young people who are taking a principled and passionate stance against the genocide, watching him mock them, I find it utterly appalling. I find it a disgraceful position, actually, for someone with his power and authority. Many other people have spoken about there was young Albanese and old Albanese. I kind of think that there's always been a part of now Prime Minister Albanese, where power was more important than anything else. And it's often a driver in politics. And so, perhaps there were thoughts and words expressed by young Albanese that people now latch onto. But if you're willing to put the pursuit of power, the ruthless pursuit of power, in front of all of your core principles, you end up doing things like that, becoming the Prime Minister, and then using that position to mock students who are desperately trying to stop a genocide. It's pretty offensive when you watch it happen.
There was an incident yesterday in the Senate of Senator Pauline Hansen coming in with an Israeli scarf. What did you think when you saw that?
Well, I mean, I have a long-standing policy in relation to that senator of never really talking about her. And I think somebody who is so utterly politically irrelevant, who is just simply seeking to do things to grandstand and to get their political attention, who has no concept of the historical realities, doesn't pretend to engage with what's happening on the ground. And I think I'm going to stick to that position.
Maybe a good one to stick to.
Yeah.
When we were walking through Lakemba the other day, there was a real sense of betrayal that people felt towards the Labor government. Is that going to harm the Labor government in the next election? And if so, do you think they'll ever be able to make up for that betrayal?
Well, when I walk down the street in Lakemba, I get a real sense of warmth, actually, and I get a sense of connection, and I feel fortunate to be part of a party that lets me speak the truth, and I get a sense from the community that they have been desperately needing at least some people in this place to speak truth, to call a genocide, to speak out against the deeply offensive, politicised weaponising of the term of anti-Semitism, and to conflate it with any kind of opposition to the state of Israel. And I think actually what the Albanese government has done, the Labor government has done, is make those people absolutely question what sometimes has been decades of commitment to the Labor Party. Because the thought was always, well, they may not be particularly trustworthy, but they'll always be better than the coalition. And if push comes to shove, they'll be on our side. Well, now push really has come to shove. And it turns out that Labor has dropped the Arab community, the Muslim community, much of multicultural Australia, dropped them like a gun. And that sense of betrayal is real. Obviously, I'd rather live in a political world where we didn't have that, where we had a government that didn't just simply use people for electoral purposes and then drop them when they get hard. It would make it harder for us as Greens politicians in some ways to have our voice heard. But I'd love to be competing with Labor to see who could be better on this. It's just not the contest we're in.
I'd like to speak as well about the Labor immigration and deportation bill. Are you able to talk a bit more about why you're very against it?
In opposition, Labor said that when it came to issues of people seeking asylum and migration laws, that they would be different to the coalition. And people took them at their word. And it turns out they are different to the coalition. They're actually even crueler and doing novel and cruel things that even the coalition hadn't conceived of in 10 years of inventive cruelty by them against people seeking asylum. I mean, this bill gives these kind of godlike powers to the immigration minister to say to anybody on a bridging visa, and there are tens of thousands of people on a bridging visa, but in its initial stages, it's probably targeted at about 4,500 people, many of them who have sought asylum and then had their asylum claims rejected in a fast-track process set up by the coalition that everybody agrees was grossly unfair. Many of them come from places like Tamils from Sri Lanka, people fleeing persecution in Iran. They've had their asylum claims unfairly rejected. Now the immigration minister wants the power to issue them with a direction, and the direction may be for a mum from Iran who's got a couple of kids here, who fears political persecution because she was part of, and continues to be part of, the Woman Life Freedom Movement, to say to her, you have to sign a passport application for yourself and your 2 kids for Iranian passports, and you have to cooperate with the deportation of yourself and your kids back to Iran, even though you fear persecution and imprisonment and torture, because the fast-track system denied you. And if you don't agree, we're going to commence a criminal prosecution against you and put you in jail for a minimum of 1 year. Take your kids off you, put them in foster care. Even the coalition hadn't come up with that as a concept. And the second part of the bill is to give the immigration minister the power to blacklist entire countries and prevent anyone from those specified countries applying to travel to Australia. Literally anyone. Absolutely severing connections between diaspora communities here and people back home. No aunts, no uncles, no adult parents, no adult kids, no brothers, no sisters, no tourism visas. Complete severing. And they said that they want to start with Iran and Iraq and South Sudan, but they want to be able to do it to any country in the world whenever they choose if they don't think that country is cooperating with forced deportations from Australia. It's in many ways an invitation to reintroduce the White Australia policy. I mean, it's largely going to be targeted at countries where the majority of people have brown skin, perhaps where their religion is, they have Muslim religion. It's an invitation, if not by this government, then a future government, to effectively reinstate the White Australia policy with no parliamentary oversight. I mean, is it any wonder we oppose that? And the more that diaspora communities and multicultural Australia learns about it, the more betrayed they feel by Labor. And so thankfully we've fought that off. Now, Labor wanted to rush it through in 36 hours, literally while it was warm on the photocopier. We forced it to an inquiry. Labor wanted to ram it through this sitting week. We managed to prevent it coming on this sitting week as well. And we've got another 6 weeks to defeat the bill, and it should never have been brought in the first place.
You're mentioning that Liberal hadn't conceived something as cruel as that bill. Why do you think Labor are playing so further to the right when, as you said, they were elected on promise and hope that they would be playing the field more for left-leaning or more progressive people, I suppose?
Labor feels like they can take the electorate, particularly multicultural Australia, but also anyone to the left of the electorate, just take them for granted. Just put their vote in their back pocket and just go on and have a contest off to the right with Peter Dutton. And they can see that Peter Dutton wants to make this election largely about migration, and I think he does, and I think it's evil and wicked. And Labor's answer to that is to outdo Dutton on cruelty. You would have thought that they would have learnt maybe from the last 2 decades, since Tampa, that the coalition doesn't really have any constraint when it comes to cruelty in this space. That they will just go one step further than Labor. And, and Labor has been, as an institution, it's utterly culpable for this kind of cruel system. They were the ones who, first of all, came up with mandatory detention. They are the ones who have, come up with some of these novel ways to be absolutely cruel to people seeking asylum. And this is their new one. Trump-like travel bans, and godlike powers to put people seeking asylum in jail. These are new, just like mandatory detention was new. I think it's critical we defeat this bill, and that Labor learns the lesson that if they try to outcrawl the coalition, it's them who will pay the political price, not those thousands of good people in our community who have come here simply to seek our protection.
You've also been very critical of the nuclear submarines and especially the potential plans to dump nuclear waste here. Are you able to speak a bit more about what those plans actually are?
Well, it'll come as no surprise to you that, I'm a Greens defence spokes. We don't much like AUKUS. $300 billion on nuclear submarines, driving our further expenditure into sort of war, conflict, trying to push us into conflict in the region. We don't much like that project. That would be reason enough for us to oppose this bill, which is trying to put in place a new defence-only regulator for the nuclear part of nuclear submarines. But then when Labor introduced the bill, we sat down, as you do, and we read it. I know it's unusual. And once we read it, we realised that it permitted the most toxic nuclear waste on the planet, which is sitting in dozens of decommissioned UK nuclear submarines. And you can go onto Google Maps and have a look at them, just outside of Plymouth and up in Scotland, sitting there in ponds, dozens of UK nuclear submarines that have been decommissioned, chock-a-block full of weapons-grade uranium that the UK has no solution for. And they've been looking for a solution for decades. They decommissioned their first submarine in 1980 and they still haven't found a solution for it. So when we read the bill and we realised it permitted the storage of any nuclear waste from UK and US nuclear submarines, I genuinely couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that they would go this far. We triple-checked the bill, we showed it to a bunch of stakeholders, they confirmed our reading, and we called out Labor on it. And then the Defence Minister came out at the end of last year and said, oh no, the Greens are scaremongering. Scaremongering. Well, we've now had it confirmed by both the Department of Defence and BAE Systems, which is the primary contractor for building the nuclear submarines. They've both confirmed that that's absolutely what the bill allows. And we have run a campaign and we've spoken with communities across the country to try and prevent that. We've now had a recommendation from even a Labor-dominated committee that the government should pull that proposal. But of course, Labor hasn't pulled that proposal yet. And so it's still a very live concern. And what is worse, it permits the storage of that toxic nuclear waste from UK or US submarines. And of course, also, if we ever get them, Australian submarines, anywhere on the country, wherever the Defence Minister chooses, without any consultation with communities, let alone First Nations communities. I mean, this bill is deeply offensive and I think it's deeply unprincipled the way Labor's gone about it.
I'd also like to chat quickly about the David McBride case, which I know you are still heavily involved in campaigning for him to escape prosecution. What about that case do you find the most troubling, especially since being handed down the sentence?
I was down here on Tuesday. I went to to a protest out the front of the court hearing because David was being sentenced on Tuesday, and I said at the front, before David had got sentenced, I said it would be an indelible stain on this government if David McBride walks into the front of the court this morning and then is taken out the back in a prison van. And appallingly, that's what happened. But I've always tried to be realistic about what's happening with David. I remember speaking with him soon after he was charged, and I have a conflict here perhaps. I consider David a friend. I consider him a very decent man. He's not an angel, but he's a very decent man who spoke truth to power and told this country for the first time ever about the war crimes that have been committed by Australian troops in Afghanistan, and we owe him a huge debt of gratitude for that. But I remember speaking with David soon after the charges were laid against him, and he's a very decent man, and he's a lawyer, and he was saying to me, look, the law can't really permit this to happen. There are checks and balances. I just told the truth. We'll find a way through. I tried to comply with the law, the public interest disclosure, and he had faith in the system. He said it more articulately than I did, but he had faith in the system And I remember saying to him, David, that's all well and good, but there's a bunch of powerful bastards who want to put you in jail. And they often get what they want in this space. And it's turned out that's a prediction you want to be wrong. But not only did they put him in jail, they gave him a 5.5-year maximum sentence and a minimum 2.5 years, guaranteed 2.5 years in jail, taking him from his kids and his family. And I went there in the morning out the front of the court. I came up here into the Senate and did a day's work in the Senate. And then I was walking home and I was talking to my wife and my kids, and I just was, I almost stopped in my tracks thinking about David being in jail that night, being in jail, this good person I knew, because he told the truth about war crimes. And I just kind of, I didn't quite know what to think. And I'm still quite shocked for the reasons David said, even though I have that kind of realpolitik view about it. I'm still quite shocked that this government, anyone of good conscience could let that happen to him. So, yeah, absolutely anyone who's engaged in this, they should communicate with their local member. They should get online. They should go to a protest. We need to get David out of jail.
I suppose with, as a last question, feeling all of that despair for that and then applying it as well with what we see happening in Gaza and the cost of living crisis and the housing crisis and everything else that's going on, a lot of us feel very hopeless. I suppose, what do you suggest we do with that and how we kind of find a way forward to pressure the government to care about things and also use our voice and I guess our anger as well?
Well, I actually, as horrific as what's happened in Gaza has been, the mass movements of millions and millions of people around the world who are seeing a genocide play out in real time, often on their phone, the mass movement has changed the political narrative on this. And whatever the toxic, nasty debate between Labor and the coalition in the Senate or in the House of Reps might be, trying to sort of demonise the students and ignore the genocide, that's not washing amongst millions and millions of Australians. And for the first time ever, I think people are getting a kind of historical and real understanding of just how our politics tries to miscast the goodies and the baddies in this space. And I think there is a powerful sense of rejection of that politics. And we see their votes shrinking, you know, and the crossbench vote growing and growing and growing. Politics does not have to be like this. You know, you don't have to keep voting for these same, you know, this bunch of lizards because they're slightly less offensive than that bunch of lizards. You can choose to vote for someone who's not a lizard. And I think people are beginning to realise that. So I have hope. I also think that the sort of the generation that's grown up, connected on social media, having a sense of agency and empowerment, is the most empathetic generation we've ever produced. And they see this essential commonality between them and someone their age with their interests. They might be in Beijing, or they might be in London, or they might be in Brazil. And this commonality, this empathy with people is, I think, one of the most valuable things we have, and it's growing, because I think there is so much more in common between just the ordinary person on the street, wandering down the street in, you know, Lakemba in Sydney, to the ordinary person walking down the street in Beijing, or the ordinary person walking down the street in Sicily or southern Sudan. We have so much more in common than our governments, who are desperately trying to divide us. And I think that's a learning. People are learning that through what we're seeing in Gaza. It's reinforcing those kind of values, that global empathy that I think is a really powerful global movement that I hope can save us from some of this toxic stuff. But I'd also say this: the battle we're having here in this place, you've got to be in it to fight it. You've got to actually fight for a different world, and you do get wins along the way. I mean, our housing spokesperson, you know, Max from Queensland, he's a bloody solid fighter, and being part of his team and backing him in and getting billions more for public and affordable housing, that's a fight worth having. Being the one political party that calls a genocide and gives some kind of political comfort to people in Australia who have had their relatives killed, that's something worth doing. Fighting for the likes of David McBride, that's bloody well worth doing. And then, fighting for nature. I love bushwalking. If I want to get my sanity back from this place, I go on long hikes. My wife and I go on long hikes. Fighting for those precious places, fighting for the reef. These are all fights we need to have. And I'd urge as many people to get engaged with politics. Don't accept that the politics you see on TV or the politics you see fed to you from the likes of Prime Minister Albanese is the way politics has to be. It absolutely doesn't. Let's take charge of this place and change the world.